In 1842, deep in the marshlands outside Savannah, Georgia, a dish was served that would never be forgotten. The Whitmore estate, a grand plantation surrounded by cypress trees and mist, had long been a symbol of Southern refinement, a place where the wealthy dined beneath chandeliers, while the enslaved toiled in silence. That winter evening, the air smelled of salt and magnolia, the river hummed low in the distance, and a supper was prepared that would seal the family's fate. Colonel Whitmore, his wife Celeste, their 2 sons and 3 guests, sat around the oak table as the household's cook, a young enslaved girl named Elias, moved quietly between kitchen and dining room. She had been raised in that house, orphaned as a child, her lullabies often echoing through the quarters long after others had gone to sleep. She was said to have the gentlest of hands, a heart soft enough to calm crying infants, and a devotion to God that even the local preacher admired. Yet before the candles burned out, every person at that table would be dead. Historians still debate what truly happened that night. Some claim the bread had been baked with spoiled yeast, tainted with a deadly fungus common to the humid marshlands. Others whisper of something far darker, a ritual disguised as supper, a curse passed down through generations of pain. What's known is that when the bodies were discovered the next morning, their expressions were eerily peaceful. Plates remained half full, glasses untouched, and no sign of struggle could be found. Only one strange detail persisted. Each victim's lips carried a faint crystalline dusting of salt. Elias, the cook who had prepared the meal, was gone. Her small cot in the servants' quarters was neatly made, her hymn book left open to a psalm about deliverance. Over time, the event became known as the Silent Feast of Whitmore Hall. Newspapers of the era offered sensational accounts. Some claimed Elias fled north disguised as a man. Others swore she drowned herself in the marsh. Plantation records, however, simply marked her as missing property. Yet her story lingered long after her disappearance. Locals began to speak of strange occurrences, the taste of salt in rainwater, the sound of soft humming near the ruins, and the sight of a pale figure standing at the edge of the flooded fields during storms. Was Elias an innocent girl undone by tragedy, or the architect of a righteous reckoning? Did grief twist her faith into fury, or was she merely another casualty of a cursed household? No one could say. But the legend endured, passed through generations like an inheritance of unease. Even now, when thunder rolls across Savannah and the wind sweeps over the marsh, some swear they can smell bread baking, a warm, sorrowful scent that carries the memory of the meal that silenced a dynasty. The Whitmore plantation once rose like a crown over the lowlands of Savannah, a mansion of white pillars and dark secrets, glistening beneath the Georgian sun. It was said that when the river mist drifted over the cypress groves at dawn, the house seemed to float above the earth itself, as if heaven and hell had both laid claim to its foundation. From a distance it appeared serene, rows of magnolia trees flanking the long gravel drive, the hum of cicadas blending with the faint echo of hymns from the servants' quarters. But inside those walls, civility was a costume and cruelty was the inheritance that gave the Whitmore name its shine. Colonel Jonathan Whitmore had inherited the estate from his father, a man rumored to have made his fortune not only through cotton, but through trade less spoken of. By 1842, the plantation covered nearly 600 acres, worked by over 60 enslaved men and women who lived in rows of cabins along the marsh. Whitmore himself was a man of contradictions, charming in public, vicious in private. His sermons on Christian virtue often followed nights of drunken rage, and his belief in providence masked a mind consumed by control. His wife, Celeste, was equally trapped, an elegant ghost drifting through the halls, her health waning and her eyes hollow from grief. The death of their infant daughter years before had changed her. She was said to wander at night, whispering lullabies to a child who would never answer. And then there was Elias. She arrived on the estate at 12, purchased from a New Orleans auction where the auctioneer described her as small but steady, good hands for kitchen work. Her given name, according to the bill of sale, was Eliasa, but the Whitmores shortened it, as if trimming her identity to fit their needs. Within months she had become indispensable. Her bread was soft and fragrant, her stews rich and comforting, her quiet presence oddly magnetic. Even Celeste, who spoke rarely and smiled less, was soothed by the girl's singing, low, mournful hymns that drifted through the halls like the sound of confession. Some said Elias prayed through song. Others whispered that she summoned something older than prayer. Visitors noted her with curiosity. A letter from a Charleston minister dated March 1840 described a strange, Melancholy calm in the kitchen. Its young servant hums in tongues that are neither English nor entirely African. He added, "Her voice trembles like the air before a storm." I confess it unsettled me. For a time, the Whitmore household thrived under her care. The Colonel's guests praised his hospitality, and his table became a local legend. Lavish dinners with imported wines, sugar confections, roasted game, and always Elias's bread. She kneaded it each morning before sunrise, her small hands moving rhythmically, whispering over the dough. The servants called it singing bread. Some said it never molded, even when left uneaten for days. But by 1841, the cracks began to show. The crops failed first. The cotton wilted under an unrelenting heat, then drowned in an early autumn storm that flooded the lower fields. Livestock grew sick, their eyes clouding white before they fell. The workers began to mutter of a curse on the land, though none dared say from whom it came. The Colonel blamed laziness, punishing men until their backs bore maps of his anger. Celeste grew paler, weaker, haunted by coughing fits that left crimson stains on her lace. The doctor called it consumption, but old Nanny May, the midwife, said quietly, "It ain't her lungs, it's her heart bleeding out through her mouth." By winter, death felt close. It was during this time that the servants began noticing Elias's peculiar habits. She had started saving scraps from the kitchen, salt, herbs, bits of root and ash, and storing them in glass jars beneath her cot. She spoke little, ate even less, and was often seen near the marsh before dawn, standing knee-deep in the fog as if waiting for something. When confronted by the housekeeper, she simply said, "I'm listening for the ones who are gone." The others avoided her after that, whispering that grief had driven her mad. But madness was not unique to Elias that year. Colonel Whitmore, once the embodiment of Southern composure, began to unravel. His letters turned erratic, filled with mentions of omens and invisible eyes watching the house. He claimed he heard weeping in the dining room when no one was there. The preacher from town visited one Sunday and found him pacing barefoot in the parlor, muttering about repaying old debts. That same week, he ordered the family silver melted down, saying it bore false reflections. Celeste's decline worsened. She no longer left her bed except to kneel by the window, staring toward the fields where the enslaved buried their dead. On one of her last lucid days, she called Elias to her room. The girl later told another servant that the mistress pressed something into her hand, a small locket containing a lock of the dead child's hair, and whispered, "If I do not wake, keep her fed." What that meant no one could say. The household grew quieter. The laughter of guests, once a nightly routine, ceased entirely. Even the birds seemed to avoid the estate. The workers prayed at their cabins, burning herbs to ward off what they could not name, and still every morning Elias sang. She sang while kneading dough, while scrubbing pots, while the house decayed around her. Her hymns were neither joyous nor mournful. They simply were. Steady. Endless. As if she was holding the world together through sound alone. Then came the supper. It was the Colonel's idea, announced suddenly one morning in March 1842. "We will dine as before," he declared. "The Lord will see we've not been abandoned." Invitations went out to neighboring planters and a visiting preacher. The table was set with the family's finest china, the silver now replaced by iron utensils. The Colonel claimed it was symbolic of strength. Elias was ordered to prepare a feast, roasted pheasant, turnip soup, and her signature bread. The other servant said she worked in silence that day, no song on her lips. As evening fell, the guests arrived. Witnesses later recalled a strange heaviness in the air, as though the house itself were holding its breath. The meal began with laughter, nervous but polite. Wine was poured, blessings were said, and for a brief moment, the Whitmore estate seemed alive again. Then the wind shifted. According to the sole surviving account, written by the preacher's wife before she succumbed, the candles flickered violently midway through supper. A bitter smell filled the room, sharp like iron. The Colonel lifted his glass to toast but froze, eyes widening as his hand began to tremble. Celeste whispered something, perhaps a prayer, before slumping forward. Within minutes the guests collapsed one by one, their faces calm, their bodies still. The only sound that followed was the slow creak of the dining room door swinging open. Then, the faint echo of a hymn drifting from the kitchen. When the morning came, the servants who had fled into the fields returned to find the house silent. The table remained set, food untouched. The dead sat as if asleep, and the smell of fresh bread lingered in the air. Elias was gone. The sheriff's men searched for her for weeks, dragging the marshes, interrogating the remaining workers. No trace was found. Some claimed she had been seen walking on the riverbank, her white apron glowing faintly in the moonlight. Others said she melted into the fog like breath in cold air. The colonel's surviving relatives offered a bounty for her capture, but none dared collect it. Rumors spread faster than truth. The local papers printed every theory: mass poisoning, foul play, divine punishment. The church called it the devil's work. But among the enslaved, a different story took root: that Elias had freed herself not by running, but by transforming, that her spirit had passed into the soil, into the salt, into every tear shed on that cursed land. Years later, when the Whitmore plantation finally crumbled, the site became a ruin swallowed by ivy and silence. Travelers claimed the air there tasted faintly of brine, and those who lingered too long often dreamed of a woman's voice, singing a lullaby in a language they couldn't name. In the end, the Whitmore estate was not just a house, it was a confession carved into the landscape. Its grandeur masked guilt. Its silence echoed with songs of the forgotten. The supper that ended it all was more than a meal. It was a reckoning served on fine china, carried by a hand that had learned to feed others long before it ever fed itself. And in that final act, whether vengeance or salvation, the House of Whitmore fulfilled its own prophecy, that everything built on cruelty eventually consumes itself. The bread that once sustained the powerful became their undoing. The voice that once sang for them became the echo that haunts them still. Even now, when the storm winds roll over the marsh and lightning strikes the river, locals swear they can hear that same melody rising from the reeds, a hymn of sorrow, defiance, and deliverance. It is said the land remembers every word. They made. Another insisted, she said, "I will feed them peace." Both statements, if true, reveal a motive too layered for vengeance alone. Perhaps she saw herself as a medium of closure, carrying a burden no one else could name. Perhaps the act was mercy, an ending too kind for those who thrived on cruelty. Over time, the supper transcended history to become myth. Poets likened it to the Last Supper inverted, with the servant as savior and the masters as disciples of death. Painters reimagined Elias bathed in candlelight, hands raised over steaming bowls. The event's ambiguity fueled obsession. The lack of proof became its power. Each generation retold it with the conviction that they alone understood the truth, yet every version contradicted the last. In this way, the story endured, not as evidence but as echo. Even in the 21st century, the phenomenon persists. Scientists testing soil samples near the original site report abnormally high saline levels during rainfall. Local radio stations broadcast recordings said to capture faint singing during storms, low, rhythmic, like a lullaby traveling through wind. No pattern, no explanation, only repetition. A historian once remarked, "Perhaps the curse is not death but remembrance." Perhaps Elias ensured they could never be forgotten. And so, every thunderclap over Savannah becomes an anniversary no one planned to celebrate. If the supper was vengeance, it was the quietest ever served. If it was salvation, it came disguised as hunger. Between those interpretations lies the truth, unprovable, unending. The Whitmore house has long since collapsed, its timbers swallowed by moss, its dining room reclaimed by water. Yet people still visit, leaving salt in small glass jars upon the ground. They do not pray aloud, they simply wait for rain. When it comes, they say it tastes faintly of tears, and of something else too, something older than grief and sweeter than forgiveness. And perhaps that is why the story endures, because somewhere between faith and fear, life and legend, one woman turned a meal into a mirror. What they consumed that night was not poison, it was reflection. It began with the rain, not the gentle kind that blesses fields, but the heavy, deliberate kind that seems to arrive with purpose, a rain that cleanses and condemns all at once. The sky over the Whitmore plantation hung low, bruised with thunder, while mist curled above the marshes like smoke from some unseen fire. Inside, the house glowed with the effort of pretending. Candles flared in the chandeliers, mirrors gleamed with borrowed light, and a table stretched across the grand dining room like an altar. Every inch had been arranged for grace. Folded napkins, gold-edged plates, crystal glasses trembling in the faint vibrations of approaching storm. It was to be a night of restoration, or at least of performance. For months, the Whitmore household had been plagued by whispers, of spoiled harvests, of servants who vanished, of Mrs. Whitmore's lingering sickness that no doctor could name. The supper was meant to silence those rumors. Instead, it immortalized them. Elias moved among the preparations like a presence half seen. Barefoot on polished wood, She gathered herbs with steady hands, whispering to herself in a dialect no one quite recognized. Some said she prayed. Others swore she was conversing with ghosts. Her voice carried through the corridors, a soft, undulating hymn that clung to the air even after she passed. The other servants avoided her that day. They claimed her eyes looked too calm, as if she already knew the outcome of the evening. In the kitchen, a great iron pot simmered on the hearth. Steam rose thick and fragrant, tinged with something indefinable. Salt and smoke, rosemary and rain. A visiting merchant who arrived early later recalled that the smell seemed alive. He said it followed him, even as he walked away, as though the air itself remembered. By dusk, guests began to arrive. 6 in total: Judge Reeves, Reverend Cawthorn, Major Leland, the merchant Mr. Parks, Mrs. Abernathy of Charleston, and Dr. Hollis. They came in fine coats and laughter, shaking off the storm as carriages splashed through the drive. Each greeted Colonel Whitmore with the politeness of men measuring decline. He stood tall, though thinner than memory, his uniform pressed but his eyes dimmed with sleepless pride. Mrs. Whitmore descended the stairs moments later, pale and perfect, one hand gripping the rail to steady herself. The sight of her drew whispers. She had not been seen in weeks, and though she smiled, it trembled. Elias watched from the doorway, unseen as the guests took their seats. The meal began with ceremony. Silver domes lifted to reveal roasted quail, buttered roots, and bread dark with molasses. Polite conversation fluttered, full of effort. The Reverend offered grace, asking the Lord to restore prosperity to this blessed house. The wind rattled the shutters as if in reply. Then came the stew, the centerpiece, the simplest dish on the table, yet the one that would outlast them all. Elias carried it herself, each step slow, deliberate. The aroma bloomed through the room like music. It was earthy, oceanic, faintly floral, impossible to name. She ladled portions with silent precision, beginning with the Colonel, ending with the Reverend. When she reached Mrs. Whitmore, their eyes met, a brief flicker like recognition across lifetimes. The first spoonful changed everything. Testimonies from surviving servants, those who watched through cracked doors, agree on one detail: silence. The guests fell into it at once, as though words had become irrelevant. For some, the flavor brought tears. Others smiled faintly, dazed. The Reverend murmured that it tasted of forgiveness. Major Leland claimed it reminded him of home. The Colonel took 3 bites, then set his spoon down, staring at nothing. Mrs. Whitmore did not eat at all. She held her bowl close, inhaling, whispering something under her breath that no one could hear. The air thickened, the candles guttered. Outside, the rain changed tempo, drumming in unison with the ticking of the clock. Elias stepped back from the table, her face unreadable. The thunder rolled again, closer now. The guests continued to eat, slower, quieter, until the rhythm of their spoons softened into stillness. Judge Reeves dropped his napkin. Dr. Hollis leaned back, sighing as if overcome by peace. And then as one, their heads lowered, resting upon folded arms or slumped shoulders. No cry, no gasp, no struggle, only stillness. By the time the butler entered, summoned by instinct rather than call, the air had cooled. 6 bowls sat half full, steam fading. Elias was gone. Panic rippled through the servants' quarters. The Colonel was dead. Mrs. Whitmore lay beside him, eyes open, lips parted as if mid-prayer. The Reverend's hands were clasped around his spoon. The others appeared merely asleep. Dr. Hollis's watch had stopped at 8:13 p.m. Investigators would later confirm all hearts had ceased within the same minute. No signs of poison were found. The stew tested harmless. Physicians speculated nervous collapse. Clergymen declared divine reckoning. But the staff whispered that Elias had sung the meal alive, that she had fed them more than food. The search began at dawn. The rain had ceased, leaving the marsh steaming with decay. Dogs tracked footprints from the kitchen to the back veranda, then across the field toward the cypress grove. The prints were small, deliberate, unhurried. They ended at the edge of the swamp, where water reflected the first gray light of morning. Some claimed to hear singing, soft, distant, echoing beneath the surface. For 3 days they dragged the swamp. No body surfaced. Only the remnants of a linen apron tangled in reeds, its hem stained faintly with salt. Rumors multiplied faster than facts. Some insisted Elias had poisoned the family with nightshade or water hemlock, masking bitterness with herbs. Others swore it was sorcery, a ritual drawn from faiths long suppressed. A few dared to say she had freed them, not killed but delivered. Folklore blossomed where evidence failed. Children in Savannah whispered that Elias walked the marshes on storm nights, singing over the water. Locals claimed the rain near Whitmore's ruins tasted faintly of brine. Years later, a traveling preacher swore he saw her reflection in a puddle, smiling, not sorrowful. What complicates every account is her absence of malice. Diaries recovered from the estate reveal no hatred, no defiance, only quiet resignation. One entry from Mrs. Whitmore, written a week before the supper, reads, "Elias prays for me each night. She says my dreams are heavy with salt. I do not know what that means, but I am not afraid." Another from the colonel himself, "She hums while she cooks. It comforts the dying dogs. Perhaps I will have her sing for me when my time comes." Those lines became the foundation for generations of debate. Was she executing vengeance or fulfilling prophecy? Decades after the tragedy, scientists re-examined preserved utensils from the Whitmore archives. Trace analysis revealed nothing unnatural. No alkaloids, no metallic residues. The bowls were clean, yet the story persisted because something deeper than science demanded it. Psychologists later called it the contagion of grief. They argued that Elias became a vessel for collective sorrow, an embodiment of guilt the town could neither confront nor absolve. Every retelling sweetened the myth, turning fact into parable. In one version, the supper is redemption, a moment where oppressors are granted peace through the mercy of the oppressed. In another, it is vengeance served with divine precision. And in some tellings, Elias never existed at all, only a spirit conjured by conscience. Even now, the site refuses stillness. When archaeologists excavated the foundation in 1911, they found no graves beneath the dining room, but the soil carried traces of sodium chloride far above natural levels. Salt, the report noted, as though rain here remembers tears. Local superstition warns travelers not to eat or drink near the ruins during storms. The air feeds enough, they say. At dusk, when the marsh wind shifts, frogs fall silent. Some hear the faint clink of silverware, others a woman's hymn woven into thunder. In the cultural memory of Georgia, the Whitmore supper evolved into moral scripture. Ministers cited it as a caution against pride. Abolitionists reinterpreted it as divine justice. Writers romanticized Elias as a tragic saint, a culinary martyr whose final act blurred the line between servitude and sovereignty. Yet across all versions, one detail remains unchanged: the calm. Whatever happened that night, it occurred without struggle. 6 souls slipped quietly into stillness, as if answering a call no one else could hear. In 1889, nearly 50 years later, a distant relative of the Whitmores published a pamphlet titled The Salted Rain, A Family's Curse. In it, he described finding a single bowl preserved in the attic, sealed with wax, contents intact. The stew had hardened to stone, pale gray, smooth as glass. He sent a fragment to a chemist in Charleston, who reported traces of calcium and organic matter, unlike any food or bone. The rest crumbled to dust within days. The bowl itself cracked during a thunderstorm and was later lost in a fire. Still, the legend of the final serving lingered. The notion that one portion had been set aside, not for the living but for remembrance. What unsettled historians most was Elias's serenity. Accounts from surviving maids describe her demeanor hours before the event: soft-spoken, composed, even tender. She offered no farewell, no warning. One maid claimed Elias whispered to her, "They will eat what stirs the appetite of something long bound beneath the soil." When storms roll in from the Atlantic, lightning illuminating the drowned ruins, the debate becomes irrelevant. The land itself seems to breathe. For all the speculation, no definitive explanation survives because the evidence behaves like faith. It multiplies through doubt. Every attempt to define Elias confines her, and she refuses confinement. Was she chemist, priestess, or mirror? Each label collapses under scrutiny. What endures is the pattern of recurrence: salt, silence, serenity. The same trinity marks every retelling, every investigation, every experiment conducted on the cursed soil. Even modern instruments fail there. Electrical readings falter, drones lose signal, cameras blur. As one researcher joked, the land edits its own footage, yet perhaps the real mystery lies not in the method of death, but in its symmetry. 6 diners, 6 bowls, 1 missing guest. Historians often overlook that 7th empty bowl found on the hearth. Who was it meant for? Was it Elias's own portion, or a final serving reserved for something unseen? In African ritual practice, offerings are left for ancestors or spirits. In Christian iconography, an empty seat signifies the presence of the divine. Whichever lens one uses, the symbolism remains potent. One place left open as if awaiting our arrival. Maybe that is why the story endures, because in some way we are all invited. The theories, when lined side by side, form not a ladder but a circle. Each returns to the same haunting question. Can suffering be purified, or does it simply change form? The poison became myth. The myth became prayer. The prayer became soil. Each new explanation feeds upon the last, like inheritance disguised as inquiry. And at the center of that circle stands Elias, silent, unaging, neither condemned nor absolved. In the end, perhaps every theory is correct. Maybe she did use herbs, guided by knowledge older than her captors. Maybe belief itself finished what the plants began. Maybe salt and sorrow share the same root, binding chemistry and spirit in ways no science can untangle. The facts resist hierarchy because the event itself was never linear. It was a collapse of opposites, a supper where poison tasted like peace and death looked like release. The land keeps its counsel. The rain still falls heavy and deliberate. Scholars will continue to measure, theologians to interpret, psychologists to hypothesize. But for those who have stood among the ruins during a thunderstorm, all theories dissolve into the same awareness. Something remains. Not ghost, not curse, but memory so dense it alters matter. And when lightning flickers across the flooded field, it's easy to imagine a figure at the water's edge, barefoot, unhurried, singing softly to the storm. Time, they say, buries truth beneath layers of explanation. Yet the story of the Whitmore supper refuses burial. Each generation digs it up again, dusting off the bones of rumor, labeling fragments of memory as science, faith, or sin. What really happened that night in 1842 has become less an event than a prism. Turn it one way, and you see vengeance. Turn it another, and you glimpse redemption. Every theory promises clarity. None deliver it. The first explanations were practical. In 1843, Dr. Horace Bellamy of Charleston examined the few preserved samples of food taken from the Whitmore kitchen. He concluded the deaths were consistent with ingestion of botanical toxins common to marshlands. Oleander, belladonna, perhaps monkshood. These plants, he noted, could be mistaken for culinary herbs by the untrained or malicious hand. His report was praised by some as rational closure, but others saw its flaws. No trace of toxin was found in surviving samples of broth or residue scraped from the bowls, nor did the symptoms, peaceful stillness, unlabored breathing, and lack of convulsion, match any known poisoning. Bellamy's conclusion, critics argued, was an attempt to impose order on the inexplicable. Still, the poison theory endured because it fit a familiar narrative, the servant's revenge. Newspaper headlines of the time delighted in the image of a silent kitchen girl turning her oppressor's appetite into execution. It was a story that both condemned and sensationalized, a morality play for a nation built on consumption. In the years leading up to the Civil War, abolitionist pamphlets retold the supper as allegory, "The bread of cruelty shall rise no more." Yet the closer historians looked, the less the details obeyed logic. Elias's knowledge of herbs was extensive, but she had no access to belladonna or monkshood, plants rare in coastal Georgia. Nor could she have hidden the bitterness of such toxins in a light broth. Chemical impossibility undermined poetic justice. Then came the second wave of theories, those of ritual and faith. Scholars of African diaspora studies later identified elements of the supper reminiscent of Winti and Vodun mourning rites, songs of passing, shared meals, symbolic cleansing through salt. In some traditions, the living feed the dead so their souls may travel peacefully, consuming grief to release pain. What if Elias's dish was not meant to kill but to cleanse? Perhaps she believed the household was already spiritually diseased, and only ritual consumption could end their torment. Anthropologist Miriam Cole, in her 1936 treatise Salted Spirits of the South, wrote, "In communities where suffering is cyclical, release often masquerades as destruction. To feed sorrow is to starve cruelty." According to this interpretation, Elias did not poison anyone. She simply enacted an inherited rite of purification, an act misread by witnesses through the lens of fear. In this telling, the Whitmores were not victims but participants, drawn unconsciously into a ceremony older than their language. Each spoonful became symbolic surrender, each heartbeat a hymn. When their bodies stilled, it was not murder, but completion. Skeptics, of course, dismissed this as romanticized mysticism. They countered with a third idea, the psychosomatic theory. By the late 20th century, psychologists began to view the Whitmore case as a perfect storm of collective guilt and suggestion. Decades of cruelty, economic decline, and superstition had eroded the household's mental stability. Elias, with her serene hymns and unreadable calm, became a focus for the family's anxieties, a mirror reflecting their own corruption. The night of the supper, Under the stress of isolation and mounting fear, they experienced what modern researchers call shared psychogenic death, a phenomenon in which belief itself triggers physiological shutdown. Dr. Leonard Graves, a forensic psychologist who studied the case in 1998, described it as mortal hypnosis. He theorized that Elias's presence, ritualized songs, and the charged atmosphere of impending doom created a psychological contagion. The victims' bodies, already weakened by illness and stress, responded to the subconscious command to stop. They were not poisoned, Graves wrote. They were convinced. Yet even he admitted the flaw in his reasoning. Psychosomatic death leaves traces of panic, tension in the muscles, residual adrenaline, signs of struggle. None were found. The Whitmores had simply stopped. Each of these explanations, chemical, ritualistic, psychological, reveals more about the interpreters than the event. The poison theorists saw human malice, the anthropologists spiritual justice, the psychologists guilt made flesh, but the evidence itself remains stubbornly neutral. 6 corpses, peaceful. 1 girl vanished. Soil that will not forget salt. Beyond that, only stories. Still, the anomalies persist. Geological surveys conducted in 1911, 1948, and again in 2004, all recorded unusually high saline concentrations in the earth surrounding the former dining room site, levels far exceeding natural groundwater patterns. Experts blamed the proximity to the marsh, but that explanation faltered when nearby fields showed normal readings. The salt seemed confined to the exact perimeter of the old house. Attempts to plant crops there failed repeatedly. Foundations cracked without cause. Engineers described the land as rejecting weight. To locals, it was simpler. The ground still hungry. Supernatural theorists seized upon this. They argued the soil's sterility signified a curse, a perpetual reminder of unatoned sin. One folklorist even proposed that the land itself had become the 7th participant of the meal, consuming not food, but memory. In this cosmology, Elias's final act was not murder, but transmutation. She turned suffering into substance, binding it to the earth so it could feed no more on the living. This notion, while poetic, raised its own questions. If she trapped pain within the soil, why does it still echo? Why do visitors report hearing hymns when it rains, or tasting salt in the mist? Perhaps, as some theologians suggest, absolution is never complete, only delayed. Religious interpretations divide sharply. To Christian chroniclers of the 19th century, Elias was a blasphemer. Her act a parody of communion, bread and broth turned to blood and salt. To liberation theologians of the 20th, she became a Christ-like figure, sacrificing herself to redeem others through an inverted Eucharist. She did not kill, wrote Reverend Thomas Agnew in 1974. She forgave in the only language cruelty could understand, silence. Modern clergy remain uneasy. Some refuse to speak her name during local sermons. Others invoke her story during Lent as a warning that mercy, when weaponized, becomes indistinguishable from wrath. The contradictions deepen when examining the testimonies of those peripheral to the event. Servants interviewed years later gave accounts that bordered on the supernatural. One, a stable boy named Samuel, recalled hearing a voice in the walls hours before the supper, a voice humming beneath the rain. Another swore the air smelled of the sea, though the tide lay miles away. Psychiatrists who reviewed these statements classified them as hysteria born of trauma. But a few researchers noticed a pattern. Every witness described a sensation of peace, not terror, as if something had ended, not begun. In 1922, a new theory emerged from an unlikely source, a chemist named Dr. Edward Lasker. Reanalyzing Bellamy's century-old notes, Lasker proposed that the stew contained trace amounts of sodium bicarbonate reacting with iron from the cooking pot, producing hydrogen gas. In a sealed environment, inhalation could have caused hypoxia and euphoria before death. It was a compelling mechanistic answer, until one considered the kitchen's size and ventilation. Such conditions were impossible. Still, the chemical rapture theory added another layer to the legend, the idea that science itself might stumble upon spirituality by accident. Perhaps the most unsettling perspective, however, comes from moral philosophers who see the supper as a metaphor rather than a mystery. They argue the question is not how the Whitmores died, but why the story insists on being told. Across every version, Elias embodies transformation, of pain into peace, of oppression into myth. Her silence consumes interpretation as thoroughly as her meal consumed life. Dr. Irene Moreau, in her 2015 essay The Banquet of Guilt, wrote, "Elias does not represent vengeance. She represents digestion. The society that devoured her people now swallows itself through remembrance." In that sense, the persistence of theories is itself the haunting. Each hypothesis is a way of feeding, of tasting the story anew, refusing to let it settle. Local superstition reinforces this cycle. Each year on the anniversary of the supper, residents of Maple Hollow leave offerings of salt at the edge of the old foundation. Some sprinkle it in circles, others pour it into the marsh water, watching it dissolve. They say it keeps the hunger quiet, yet others claim it awakens it, that each ritual retelling. Maple Hollow never truly recovered from the night the Whitmores died. The town was small even then, just a scattering of homes, a chapel, a mill, and the plantation's vast silhouette looming over the marshes like a reminder of everything people tried not to see. But after that supper in 1842, Maple Hollow began to change. The change was not sudden. It was slow, seeping, like rot beneath polished wood. At first, there were whispers, nothing more than cautious talk over fences and in pews. The Whitmores' deaths were too bizarre to be understood, too abrupt to be accepted. Their bodies had been laid out in the parlor for inspection, their faces so peaceful it unsettled everyone who looked. No convulsions, no wounds, no foam or fever, just that faint trace of salt on their lips. The coroner, an aging man named Joseph Kane, wrote that the sight made him feel as if they had been gently erased. The household staff fled within days, claiming to hear singing in the kitchen after midnight. The melody was described as low and wordless, almost like a hum. When Kane returned to collect more notes, he found the house's windows fogged from the inside, though the air outside was cold. From that point, the Whitmore estate began to decay faster than nature could explain. Paint peeled, the porch sagged, and the garden, once filled with roses, wilted into blackened stems within a single season. Maple Hollow's people began to talk about Elias, the vanished kitchen maid. Some said she had been seen near the river, kneeling, her reflection smiling even when she was not. Others swore she appeared at the church, her hands clasped in prayer, vanishing when approached. There was no proof of any of this, but the fear was contagious. No one would enter the Whitmore property after dusk. Hunters avoided its woods. Children dared each other to go near, and never did. By the time the Civil War began, Maple Hollow had learned to live around its silence. The estate became a landmark of dread, its name spoken softly, as if too much attention might wake whatever lingered there. But the haunting did not remain confined to the plantation grounds. It began to spread, subtly, insidiously, into the town itself. The first strange occurrence came in the form of scent. Rain would bring with it an aroma of stew, herbs, smoke, and something faintly sweet. It rolled through the streets like memory itself. Housewives swore they smelled it coming from their own kitchens, though no pot simmered on the stove. One woman, Sarah Lane, claimed she followed the scent to her backyard and found the soil warm, steaming slightly, even in winter frost. She moved away within the month. Then came the humming. Not everyone could hear it, but those who did described it as human and close, but without a source. It seemed to move through walls, linger in corners, vanish when one tried to follow. The local pastor declared it the voice of repentance, echoing through the damned soil. Scientists decades later, testing audio frequencies in the area, detected low, irregular vibrations consistent with subsonic waves, but none could trace their origin. Each generation of Maple Hollow has its stories. In 1891, a pair of surveyors camped near the ruins of the Whitmore estate reported their compasses spinning wildly and their campfire refusing to light. They left their equipment behind and fled before dawn. In 1924, the new church bell, meant to re-establish faith in the town, cracked the first time it tolled. Its fragments were later found to contain salt crystals within the iron, a detail that baffled metallurgists. By the 1950s, Maple Hollow had become a kind of curiosity for folklore researchers. Students from nearby colleges came to document its legends. One recorded over 30 eyewitness accounts describing the same vision: a young black woman in a linen dress, standing barefoot on the flooded marsh path, her eyes reflecting light like glass. "She never moves," one witness said. "She just looks at you, and you feel every sin you've ever hidden rise to the surface." But not all believed. Skeptics dismissed it as hysteria, a town haunted by guilt rather than ghosts. After all, the Whitmore's wealth had been built on suffering. Elias's story was that of the voiceless, a life consumed by servitude and sorrow. Psychologists began to interpret the phenomena as cultural inheritance, trauma passed through generations, manifesting as superstition. "They are haunted," wrote Dr. Meredith Coyle in 1973, "not by a spirit, but by their own reflection." Still, the evidence would not cooperate with reason. In 1978, investigator Daniel Greaves conducted a series of environmental studies on the Whitmore grounds. His notes, later published posthumously, revealed data that defies explanation. The soil around the ruins exhibited unusually high salinity, comparable to seawater, despite being miles inland. Temperature readings fluctuated unpredictably, with heat signatures appearing and vanishing within seconds. Most strikingly, electromagnetic interference rendered his recording devices useless. "It is not noise," Greaves wrote. "It is silence that resists being recorded." Shortly after his final visit, Greaves was found dead in his motel room, a half-finished report beside him. The last line read, "The silence feels sentient." Locals took that as proof that Elias's presence still lingered, not malevolent, but mournful. They began leaving offerings near the ruins, bowls of broth, sprigs of thyme, small crosses carved from willow wood. For a time, this seemed to calm the disturbances. Then, one autumn storm in 1984, lightning struck the site, igniting what remained of the structure. The flames burned green and blue, as if salt-fed, and afterward, nothing but the foundation remained. Modern Maple Hollow is quiet, but not peaceful. Tourists visit during Halloween season, drawn by stories of the Salt Ghost, as locals grimly nickname Elias. The town tolerates it. After all, tourism pays bills, but there is still unease. Radios cut out on the drive toward the old grounds. Phones glitch. Some report hearing humming when the wind rises off the marsh. Others taste salt on their lips after rain. Local historians have tried to reconcile myth with fact, searching for records of a real Elias, any trace of her life beyond that supper. A single entry was found in a plantation ledger. Elias, 12 years, 85, quiet girl, skilled with herbs. No last name, no burial record, no freedom papers, nothing after 1842. Even those who dismiss the haunting cannot ignore the patterns. Every decade or so, something happens that reawakens the story. A collapse, a flood, a death. In 2005, during a property development attempt near the marsh, 3 workers fell ill after digging the foundation. Medical reports listed dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. Each described a metallic taste in their mouths before fainting. Construction was halted indefinitely. The haunting of Maple Hollow has become less about fear and more about reflection. The people who remain speak of it with a mixture of reverence and regret. Some claim the haunting is not a curse, but a kind of moral balance, that Elias's song continues so the town will never forget the cost of its comfort. An elderly woman, interviewed in 2016, said softly, "We deserve the humming. It keeps us honest." Still, there are those who wish to silence it. A recent pastor, Father Callum Hayes, conducted a midnight prayer vigil at the ruins, seeking to release the spirit from bondage. Witnesses say that as he began the final prayer, the wind died completely, and his candle would not stay lit. He stopped mid-verse and left the site pale and trembling. When asked what he felt, he answered only, "She was listening." For scientists, the Whitmore mystery remains an unsolved environmental phenomenon. For theologians, it is a parable of guilt and grace. For locals, it is simply life, one in which rain smells of stew, silence hums like memory, and the line between sin and sorrow has long since blurred. There is one last curiosity. Every attempt to plant crops on the old plantation grounds fails. The soil, though rich in minerals, refuses to bear fruit. Seeds rot before sprouting, as if life itself is denied permission to return. Yet in the moonlight, Some claim to see faint glimmers, tiny reflections, like salt crystals scattered in the dirt. Scientists have tested samples repeatedly, finding nothing unusual. But locals believe they are tears, Elias's, or perhaps the land's. Visitors sometimes describe feeling watched, not with menace, but with melancholy. One tourist wrote, "Online, it felt like someone was standing beside me waiting for me to apologize." And perhaps that is the true haunting of Maple Hollow, not the specter of a wronged girl, but the weight of remembrance itself. A silence that holds a question no one can answer. If suffering endures long enough, does it become sacred? In the end, Maple Hollow remains divided. Half the town denies the haunting, calling it myth wrapped in moral convenience. The other half lights candles when storms approach. But both sides agree on one thing: the rain still tastes of salt. And when the wind stops, when every sound fades and even the crickets fall silent, someone somewhere begins to hum. The story of Elias, the kitchen maid who vanished after serving death in silence, has long since slipped beyond the grasp of history and entered something far stranger: myth. In Maple Hollow, her name is not just remembered. It is lived, whispered, tasted. What began as an isolated tragedy in 1842 has become a kind of mirror through which each generation sees its own reflection, its guilt, its pride, its hunger for meaning. And like all mirrors, it distorts as much as it reveals. By the early 1900s, Elias's story was already folklore. Children dared each other to walk past the ruins of the Whitmore estate at night, warning that the girl's song could lure you into the marsh. Old women in town used her name as a warning: behave, or Elias will season your soul. Yet for others, especially the descendants of enslaved families, her tale carried a different resonance. She was not a monster or a ghost, but a symbol of quiet justice, a servant who reclaimed agency through a single act that no one could undo. Across the decades, artists and preachers alike reshaped the story to suit their own truths. In 1918, a traveling theater troupe performed The Salted Supper, a morality play that portrayed Elias as an angel disguised in rags, sent to purify a corrupt house. In 1937, during the Harlem Renaissance, a poet named Callie Monroe reimagined her as Saint Elias of the Marsh, a woman who turned sorrow into sacrament. Her lines read, "She stirred the pot with holy hands and fed them what they made her eat. Their hunger, their cruelty, their sins, dissolved in brine and heat." Even within the church, Elias's legend found uneasy footing. Some ministers condemned the story as blasphemy. Others wove it into sermons about deliverance. One preacher from Savannah declared, "She served not vengeance but judgment, the Lord's Supper in shadow." Another, more cautious, warned that to sanctify her act was to confuse mercy with wrath. Thus, Elias became both sinner and saint, witch and witness, the embodiment of contradiction. As time passed, historians tried to strip away the superstition. They studied plantation records, weather reports, trade documents. They interviewed descendants, searched archives, analyzed soil samples. Yet every rational path led back to the same crossroads, an event that refused explanation. What none of them could ignore was the consistency of one detail: salt. Salt on the lips of the dead. Salt in the soil. Salt in the air after storms. Chemists attributed it to natural mineral deposits. Folklorists saw it as metaphor. The tears of the oppressed crystallized into permanence. It is this symbolic power that made Elias's story endure. Her dish, as it came to be called, transformed from a literal meal into a moral emblem. Anthropologists have noted parallels to ancient rituals across continents. The idea that food can bridge the gap between life and death, that a shared meal can carry memory as much as sustenance. In some West African traditions, the act of cooking for the dead was considered sacred, a way of binding grief to the living world, of feeding pain so it could pass. Whether Elias knew such customs or rediscovered them instinctively, no one can say, but the essence remains. She turned nourishment into remembrance, the everyday act of cooking into an instrument of transformation. Psychologists studying generational trauma often cite the Elias effect, a term coined by Dr. Samuel Whitaker in 1989 to describe how unresolved guilt and suffering can embed themselves into cultural consciousness, resurfacing as myth or ritual. Whitaker argued that Maple Hollow's obsession with Elias was less about her deed than what it represented. A collective effort to digest history, he wrote, to swallow what was once unbearable. In this sense, Elias's legacy is not confined to the past. It is the mechanism by which the town continues to live with what it cannot forget. Then came the discovery. In 2003, a team of archaeologists from the University of Georgia excavated the overgrown remains of the Whitmore Kitchen Foundation. Most of what they found was expected: charred wood, fragments of porcelain, rusted tools. But one item stood apart: a curved piece of pottery, part of what appeared to be a serving bowl. Its glaze was fractured yet smooth to the touch, and embedded within its surface was the faint impression of a human palm. The print was deliberate, pressed before the clay had hardened, as if someone had left their mark intentionally. The fragment ignited a new wave of fascination. To some, it was definitive proof of Elias's hand, her final signature, immortalized in earth and fire. Museums debated whether to display it. Churches argued whether it was holy or cursed. One historian called it a fingerprint of defiance. Another dismissed it as coincidence. Yet even skeptics admitted that the fragment's presence was uncanny. Its surface still carried a trace of saline residue, resistant to all cleaning attempts. The artifact was placed in controlled storage, but those who handled it often reported the same sensation: a faint warmth, like holding something alive. A museum technician described it as the feeling of being watched, but gently, like someone waiting for you to understand. The fragment has since been dubbed the Palm of Elias, and replicas have appeared in galleries, podcasts, and even church altars across the South. This modern resurgence has blurred the line between folklore and faith even further. In 2015, a grassroots movement known as the Salt Supper Collective began hosting annual community feasts in honor of Elias. Participants gathered to share simple meals of root stew and cornbread, reciting her story as both lament and celebration. The organizers claim it is not worship but remembrance, a ritual of reckoning for generations who inherited privilege, pain, or both. Critics accuse them of romanticizing tragedy. Supporters say they are finally giving voice to the voiceless. And so Elias lives on, in scholarship, in ceremony, in silence. She has become a vessel for questions that never lose relevance. What does justice look like when all other forms are denied? Can suffering purify, or does it merely perpetuate itself in new shapes? Is forgiveness possible without acknowledgement? Modern theologians have drawn bold comparisons between Elias's supper and the Eucharist, the act of consuming bread and wine as the body and blood of Christ. In both there is transmutation, pain into purpose, death into communion. Yet Elias's version inverts the divine hierarchy. Instead of the master feeding the servant feeds the master. Instead of salvation through sacrifice, it is revelation through consequence. The dish becomes a moral reversal, a mirror in which humanity sees its cruelty reflected then consumed. For others, her legacy is psychological rather than spiritual. Elias's story, they argue, represents a confrontation with trauma long suppressed. It is not merely about vengeance or mystery, but about the invisible residue of violence, the way it clings to memory, to bloodlines, to landscapes. Just as salt preserves, so too does history preserve the taste of what was done. There is irony in how the town that once feared her now profits from her myth. Maple Hollow sells Elias stew mix in tourist shops. Murals of her likeness, half angel, half shadow, decorate cafe walls. Every October, a salt festival draws thousands, where locals reenact the supper under lantern light. To outsiders it seems harmless, even charming, but older residents remain uneasy. "They turned our ghost into a mascot," one woman told a documentarian. "That's not remembering. That's rewriting." Still, memory is never pure. It is always an act of reshaping, seasoning truth until it can be swallowed. Perhaps that is Elias's true power. She cannot be fully consumed or explained. Her dish, her song, her silence, all endure precisely because they resist closure. In a rare diary found in 2019, belonging to a Whitmore cousin who visited months before the tragedy, a line stands out. The girl sings while she cooks, and the house listens. It feels like a prayer one should not hear. This fragment, mundane and haunting, adds nothing factual, yet deepens everything. It suggests awareness even then, that something in Elias's presence transcended the ordinary. Today, Maple Hollow stands quieter than ever. The old plantation site is fenced off, its ruins overgrown with moss and marshweed. Yet visitors still come, historians, ghost hunters, descendants. Some bring flowers, some bring salt. They leave it on the foundation stones, not as superstition but as acknowledgement, a gesture that says we remember. And when rain falls, as it always does, they say the air warms, carrying the faint scent of herbs and smoke. The drops that land on skin taste faintly of the sea. Scientists claim it is coincidence, a quirk of minerals and wind. But to those who know the story, it feels like a presence, a quiet reminder that the past does not vanish. It seasons the present. In that way, Elias's legacy is not confined to Maple Hollow at all. It echoes wherever history tries to hide its hungers. She has become a symbol for those silenced by circumstance, for the buried truths that resurface in art, in ritual, in memory. The dish that carried death also carried something else, the impossible persistence of meaning. Whether she acted out of rage or mercy may never be known. But perhaps that uncertainty is her final gift. For in every retelling, every reenactment, every quiet evening when rain drips through trees and the air tastes of salt, people are forced to confront what they would rather forget. That even the smallest act of defiance can echo for centuries. The silence can feed the living long after the dead are gone, and somewhere in that silence perhaps Elias still hums. The Whitmore estate is gone now, swallowed by moss, marsh, and memory. Only the foundation stones remain, half buried beneath tangled vines and the slow, patient hand of time. Yet even in ruin it endures. People still come, some out of curiosity, some out of reverence, and some out of something harder to name, a hunger that no history book can satisfy. They come to touch the earth where the house once stood, to taste the air that still carries the faint trace of salt, to listen for a song no living voice should know. And though centuries have passed, the question remains as sharp as ever. What truly happened that night in the Whitmore dining room? Every retelling shifts the flavor. To some, Elias was a murderer, a girl who weaponized her servitude, who turned the very symbol of nurturing, a meal, into an instrument of vengeance. To others, she was a savior, a vessel through which divine justice was poured. Still others believe she was simply human, a fragile soul crushed by cruelty until her kindness collapsed into something terrible and holy. Like the salt in the soil, the truth seeps through every version, invisible yet undeniable. Historians still test the ground, analyzing its chemical makeup, its strange resistance to growth. Theologists continue to debate whether her act was sacrament or sin. Psychologists call it collective trauma, a story born from guilt and grief retold until myth became memory. Yet none of them can explain why the story feels alive, why the air itself seems to pulse when storms roll through Maple Hollow. The rain, locals insist, still tastes faintly of tears. Perhaps the real mystery is not what Elias did, but what her story continues to do. For every generation that hears it, the tale becomes something different. A mirror for our fears, our desires, our need to make sense of pain. It invites questions we cannot answer. Can love and hate exist in the same breath? Can vengeance ever cleanse or only contaminate? Can the oppressed claim divinity through destruction? Elias forces us to look inward, to taste our own contradictions. The Whitmore tragedy lingers because it refuses closure. It denies the comfort of resolution. Whether it was poison or prayer, ritual or revolt, the result was the same. Silence, peace, and a strange beauty in the aftermath of horror. Perhaps that is why the legend endures. It transforms suffering into story, cruelty into communion. The dish that carried death became a feast of remembrance, feeding something deeper than hunger, a craving for understanding, for redemption, for meaning. So maybe the stew was never meant to feed the body at all. Maybe it was meant to nourish the myth, to keep the story alive long after the house was gone, long after names faded from ledgers and graves. For even now, when the rain falls soft and steady over the ruins, the air thick with salt and sorrow, it feels as though the story is still being served. And somewhere in that silence, Elias is still singing.